Hello, this is Sam and Charlie. The first question was for us to address how we can develop a strategic enrollment plan that is mission and equity focused rather than being solely market driven, and how we can have business strategies that allow us to be faithful stewards of institutional funding and resource needs. And then the second question that we'll address is, in addition to benefiting students, how might our approach to strategic enrollment management reduce burnout and resignations that plague not only admissions, but many enrollment-focused positions in higher education? As Charlie and I were speaking, we both have held executive positions and so have experience working with recruitment, enrollment, retention. One of the things that we noticed in the readings was it was interesting to learn about the history and evolution of enrollment, the pressures that have been put on higher education to increase enrollment, how things have become more competitive and people have reached out to consultants. We talked about big data and things like that. Some of the things that I jotted down were, I apologize if they sound cliche, but like developing a strategic enrollment plan that is mission and equity focused. In my experience, working with different strategic plans that look at mission, a lot of times people would create plans and then it just sits on a shelf. So ideas are created. Oh, this is how we're going to increase marginalized populations, but then there's never any, like, it's one thing to develop those goals. It's another to then work with people and identify how we're going to do it. One of the big things that we talked about, especially when it comes to being equity focused, is taking a hard look at what kind of barriers exist in all facets of college operations. What I found, a lot of times people will address those barriers, but then they don't do anything about it. I mentioned with him briefly that Northeastern, where I'm at, we had Dr. Julia Mifuz, and she had two other people come, and she spent all spring semester. I asked her to do an institutional equity audit, how students are treated when they're looking into college. The enrollment process, financial aid, and all of that. We've identified barriers. My goal in the next, I'm going to make a 3-year plan then, is then how are we going to reduce those barriers? I'll let Charlie talk about, we talked about things that the way power structures are set up can reinforce racist, gendered exclusion. Communication, how we communicate can reinforce that. Yeah, Charlie and I will tag team, so I'll let him, because he's the philosopher and he's much more eloquent than and me.
I have two answers, one within the colonial frame and one that's decolonial. Within the colonial frame, I've also been in this role and come to the course seeking the ability to think beyond what I have to do in my day-to-day job and to ponder radically about ways that I can transform the way that we do the work on a day-to-day basis. And so that's the reason for the two lines of inquiry. First, I think really quickly within the colonial frame, we were speaking before, I talked about my particular identifying structural barriers and being open and willingness to part with tradition that's usually not informed by any particular federal or state law or policy, or even sometimes the institution's policy. It's just a preference of a group of individuals who made a decision at some point in the institution's history to do certain processes. Within the decolonial frame, I think it's fascinating because the contradiction and the dissonance between higher education and its origin and its function and its identity makes the inquiry impossible. Because as Hostler and Bontrager point out, the privatization of the operations and the entire entity that is higher education has been long serving, while other scholars would infer that you can track the privatization of higher education back to its origin. Hostler and Bontrager put it at a specific starting point. And I think that it's really interesting. You don't need decolonial theory to engage with the contradictions because Hostler and Bontrager are alluding to them with being able to acknowledge that this is a private sector entity beholden to specific corporate interests. I think how do you do that? How do you answer the first question? You can't do that within the dissonance between a public serving and a public good and a corporation. I don't think it's possible. And I think that's what continues to lead to the second question, which is to burnout, is
Burnout.
because we're running in a circle, not acknowledging the dissonance and the contradiction of being a public entity that's supposedly for public good, which was not the origin of higher education, but it's the rhetorical version that we tell ourselves via the kind of white stream of history. I think that within the decolonial piece, I don't think that it's possible via the contradictions and dissonance that are the premier within the field of higher education, but taking an honest reflection on the function, the dissonance between the values, the ethics, the function, and the origin of higher education institutions would really expedite our change and transformation processes light years.
Yeah, and you talked about burnout. I think the average admissions person works 2 to 3 years and they get burnt out. And why is that? It's numbers. I mean, it's essentially a sales position, high stress. And I've often said if there's two jobs I would not want in a university. One is admissions and the other is fundraising. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much effort I put into it, it's the bottom line. How many students did I recruit or how many dollars did I raise? And I think that mindset is problematic. Now, I know people that if we had CFOs in this group, they would say it's a business and you got to pay the bills and you're relying on income derived from tuition. And I get that.
I think that's a contradiction, right? Because it can't be both and. It can't be a public good and what you just said. It
So
can't.
what I was going to say, there needs to be a shit like when we were talking about an epistemological shift.